She felt her final moments arrive, until the touch of an angel changed everything forever. Sarah had always considered herself to be in good health. She wasn't the type to rush to the doctor for every little ache or sniffle. At 42, she prided herself on her ability to keep up with her two teenage sons, maintain a demanding job, and still find time to volunteer at the local animal shelter. But looking back, there had been signs. It began with small things, a persistent fatigue that didn't seem to lift no matter how much sleep she got, minor aches she brushed off as stress, and a faint shortness of breath during her morning walks. "I'm just overdoing it," she'd tell herself. "I'll slow down soon." But soon never came. Then there was the day she blacked out at work. It had been a typical Wednesday. Sarah was rushing between meetings, juggling phone calls, and mentally ticking off her to-do list when the edges of her vision started to blur. At first, she thought it was just the fluorescent lights or the lack of lunch catching up to her. But within seconds, the dizziness overwhelmed her. She remembered hearing someone call her name and the distant sound of a chair scraping the floor. After that, everything went black. When Sarah came to, she was lying in a hospital bed, her sister Emily sitting beside her with a worried expression. "You fainted," Emily explained, her voice unusually gentle. "The office called an ambulance. They ran some tests, Sarah. The doctor wants to talk to you." Sarah had waved it off at first, chalking it up to exhaustion. But deep down, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. The doctor arrived shortly after, his face a careful mask of professionalism. Sarah's heart sank. She'd seen that look before, the same one doctors wore when they were about to deliver bad news. "Sarah," the doctor began, pulling up a chair. "The initial tests show some abnormalities in your blood work and scans. We need to run further tests, but there's a possibility we're looking at something serious." She nodded, too stunned to speak. The word serious echoed in her mind, taking on a life of its own. Over the next few days, she underwent more tests, each one more invasive and draining than the last. The waiting was excruciating. Every moment stretched into an eternity as Sarah alternated between hopeful denial and paralyzing fear. Finally, the results came in. The doctor's voice was calm but firm as he explained. "Sarah, you have an aggressive form of lymphoma. It's advanced, but there are treatment options. We'll need to act quickly." The words hit her like a physical blow. Lymphoma? Cancer? She felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Sarah sat there, frozen, as the doctor outlined the next steps: chemotherapy, radiation, and the grueling road ahead. Emily squeezed her hand, but Sarah barely felt it. All she could think about were her boys. How would she tell them? How would they manage without her if the worst happened? That night, Sarah lay awake in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Was this her fault? Had she ignored the signs for too long? She thought of her sons, Jeremy and Ethan, only 16 and 14, respectively. They still needed her. Who would make sure Jeremy applied to college? Who would cheer Ethan on at his soccer games? The thought of leaving them motherless brought tears streaming down her cheeks. But amidst the fear, a small, stubborn part of Sarah refused to give in. She had fought through tough times before. She would fight this too for her boys. She resolved to take things one day at a time, focusing on whatever she could control. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she clung to the hope that, somehow, she would find a way through this. The days that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, insurance calls, and consultations. Emily was her rock, attending every meeting and taking notes when Sarah couldn't focus. Friends and neighbors began to rally around her, offering to drive her to treatments or watch the boys. It was overwhelming at first, but Sarah slowly began to accept the outpouring of support. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. One evening, after putting the boys to bed, Sarah sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet, but her mind was anything but. The fear of the unknown loomed large, and for the first time, she allowed herself to break down completely. Tears flowed freely as she whispered a prayer into the stillness. God, I don't know how to do this. I don't even know if I can. Please, if you're listening, I need help. I can't leave my boys. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah threw herself into the fight. Chemotherapy began, bringing with it a host of side effects. Her once thick hair started to fall out in clumps, and her energy levels plummeted. There were nights when she couldn't keep food down, mornings when just getting out of bed felt like a victory. But through it all, she tried to stay strong for her boys. Jeremy, ever the protective older brother, began taking on more responsibilities around the house, while Ethan did his best to keep her spirits up with his jokes and stories. Their resilience fueled her determination, but there were still times when doubt crept in. One particularly difficult evening, Sarah found herself in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. The pale, gaunt woman in the mirror was almost unrecognizable. She felt like a shadow of her former self, and for the first time, she wondered if the fight was worth it. What if the treatments didn't work? What if she was only prolonging the inevitable? It was in that moment of despair that Sarah remembered the prayer she had whispered weeks earlier. She closed her eyes and repeated it, this time with more conviction. God, if there's a way, please show me. I'm trying, but I need help. Though the room remained silent, Sarah felt a faint sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough to get her through the night. Looking back, she couldn't have known that her quiet plea for help would soon be answered in the most extraordinary way. For the first few weeks after her diagnosis, Sarah managed to hold on to a thin veneer of strength. She threw herself into the battle with determination, diligently attending appointments and following her doctor's advice. But as the days turned into weeks and the side effects of chemotherapy began to take their toll, Sarah found herself spiraling into a dark place. It wasn't just the physical toll, though that alone was overwhelming. The treatments drained her energy, leaving her too exhausted to do even the simplest tasks. Her once lustrous brown hair, which her boys used to tease her about because she spent so much time brushing it, began falling out in clumps. The mirror became her enemy, reflecting a version of herself she didn't recognize. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and her body felt like a stranger's. But the emotional weight was far worse. Sarah had always prided herself on being the rock for her family. After her divorce, she'd taken on the roles of both mom and dad without complaint. She'd worked tirelessly to provide for her sons, juggling her full-time job with soccer practices, parent-teacher meetings, and late-night homework help. She was the one who fixed things, who had the answers. Now, she felt helpless, as though the foundation she'd built for her family was crumbling beneath her. The boys tried their best to be strong, but Sarah could see the worry in their eyes. Jeremy, her oldest, had started coming home straight after school, skipping his usual hangouts with friends. He'd take over cooking dinner, though his repertoire consisted mostly of spaghetti and scrambled eggs. Ethan, her youngest, had become quieter, retreating to his room more often. The laughter that once filled their home had been replaced with a heavy silence. One evening, after another grueling day of treatment, Sarah sat alone in the living room. The boys were upstairs, and the house was eerily quiet. She looked around at the family photos on the wall, pictures of beach trips, birthdays, and holidays. Her heart ached as she wondered if this was the legacy she would leave behind. Would her boys remember her as the strong, vibrant woman in those photos, or as the frail, sickly shadow she had become? The thought was too much to bear. For the first time since her diagnosis, Sarah allowed herself to cry openly. She sobbed into her hands, her body shaking with the force of it. She felt utterly alone, as though no one could truly understand the depth of her pain and fear. I can't do this, she whispered into the darkness. It's too much. It was then that a memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years. She was 10 years old, sitting on her grandmother's porch during a summer storm. As the rain poured down, she had been crying over something she couldn't even remember now. Her grandmother, a deeply spiritual woman, had placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Whenever life feels too heavy, just give it to God. Let him carry what you can't." The memory brought a strange sense of comfort. Sarah wasn't particularly religious, but in that moment, she decided to pray. She folded her hands and closed her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "God, if you're there, I need help. I don't know how to do this. Please, just give me a sign that I'm not alone." The room remained silent, but Sarah felt a small, unexpected flicker of peace. It wasn't the kind of dramatic answer she'd hoped for, but it was something. She wiped her tears and decided to take things one day at a time. For now, surviving the night felt like enough. The weeks that followed were a blur of highs and lows. On good days, Sarah managed to sit at the kitchen table with her boys, sharing stories and even laughing at Ethan's ridiculous jokes. On bad days, she couldn't muster the strength to get out of bed. It was during those bad days that the doubts crept in. What if this doesn't work? She would wonder as she lay staring at the ceiling. What if I'm putting my body through all this pain for nothing? One particularly bad night, Sarah found herself spiraling again. The pain from the treatment was unbearable, and the nausea wouldn't relent. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. All she could do was lie there, consumed by the fear that this was her end. The boys had gone to bed hours ago, and the house was dark and quiet. She felt as though the walls were closing in. In her desperation, she whispered another prayer. "God, I don't know if you're listening, but I need you. Please, just show me something, anything, to let me know it's going to be okay." This time, something remarkable happened. As Sarah lay there in the dark, a strange warmth began to fill the room. It wasn't a physical warmth, but more like an enveloping sense of calm that seemed to radiate from nowhere. She felt her breathing slow, the tension in her body easing for the first time in days. A thought crossed her mind, soft, almost like a whisper. "You're not alone." It wasn't an audible voice, but it was clear and distinct, as though the words had been placed directly into her heart. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of despair. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but she knew, deep in her soul, that she had been heard. The experience didn't erase her illness or the challenges ahead, but it gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't fighting this battle alone. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself returning to that moment whenever the weight of her illness threatened to overwhelm her. She began keeping a small journal by her bedside, jotting down her thoughts and prayers before going to sleep. She didn't know if anyone was reading them, but it made her feel less alone. Her family began to notice a change in her. "You seem different, Mom," Jeremy said one evening as they sat on the couch watching a movie. "Like calmer." Sarah smiled, ruffling his hair. "Maybe I am," she replied. She didn't tell him about the warmth she'd felt or the whisper of reassurance, but she carried it with her like a hidden treasure. Though the road ahead was still uncertain, Sarah felt stronger, steadier. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she believed she could face it, and she believed she wouldn't be facing it alone. Sarah's health had reached its lowest point. The treatments were wearing her down faster than they seemed to help, and even though she clung to the flicker of hope from her earlier prayer, the days were grueling. Each morning felt like a mountain to climb, and by night, she was utterly spent. She had been pushing herself for weeks, trying to stay strong for her boys, but her body was beginning to feel like a hollow shell. Deep down, she feared she couldn't take much more. It was on one such night, one of those nights where the despair felt unbearable, that everything changed. Sarah had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the streetlight outside her window, its light casting faint shadows on the walls. Her body ached, her head pounded, and her mind was a storm of thoughts she couldn't quiet. Every breath felt labored, and the silence in the house only amplified her loneliness. The boys had gone to bed hours ago, and Sarah had done her best to reassure them that she was fine. But she wasn't fine. That night, the weight of her illness felt heavier than ever before, pressing down on her chest like a physical force. She turned her head toward the window, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she whispered to the empty room. As she lay there, the exhaustion finally began to overtake her. Her eyes grew heavy, and her breathing slowed. Just as she was about to drift into an uneasy sleep, something unexpected happened. At first, it was subtle, a sense that the air in the room had shifted. It wasn't a breeze or a change in temperature, but rather a feeling, as though the very atmosphere had grown heavier, yet more peaceful at the same time. Sarah opened her eyes, suddenly alert. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a presence in the room. The glow came next. It began as a faint shimmer near the corner of her bedroom, barely noticeable at first. But as she watched, the light grew brighter, filling the room with a golden warmth that felt both gentle and overwhelming. Sarah sat up slightly, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure whether she was dreaming or awake. And then she saw it. Standing at the foot of her bed was a figure unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't solid in the way a person is solid, but it wasn't translucent either. The being seemed to radiate light, its edges soft and glowing. It was neither male nor female, yet its presence was deeply comforting. The figure had no wings, yet Sarah knew instinctively that it was an angel. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. She wasn't afraid, but the sheer beauty of the figure left her speechless. Its light wasn't blinding, but enveloping, wrapping around her like a warm embrace. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though every worry, every fear had been lifted from her shoulders. The angel smiled, a gesture so serene and filled with love that Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. It was a smile that seemed to say, "I know you. I see your pain, and you are not alone." Sarah tried to speak, but no words came. It didn't matter. The angel's voice wasn't audible in the traditional sense. Rather, it resonated within her, a soft yet powerful presence in her mind. "You are loved," it said, "more than you can imagine." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Sarah couldn't describe. It was as though the angel wasn't just speaking to her mind, but directly to her soul. In that moment, all the fear, the doubt, the anguish she had been carrying melted away. She felt lighter, freer, as though a part of her she didn't even know was broken had been healed. "Why me?" Sarah managed to whisper. Her voice was shaky, barely audible. The angel's expression didn't change, but Sarah felt the answer as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. "Because you matter," it said. "Your journey is not over. You are not alone." Sarah felt a hand, gentle, warm, and indescribably soft, touch her shoulder. The sensation sent a wave of energy through her body, unlike anything she had ever felt. It wasn't like the energy she'd known before her illness, nor was it the artificial energy from medication. This was something deeper, something pure. It filled her from head to toe, igniting a spark of life within her that she thought had been extinguished. The angel's light grew brighter for a moment, and Sarah instinctively closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. The room was silent once more, and the faint glow of the streetlight had returned. But Sarah was different. She lay back against her pillow, tears still streaming down her face. but they were no longer tears of despair. For the first time in months, she felt truly at peace. Her body still ached, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but the hopelessness that had consumed her was gone. In its place was a quiet assurance, a deep, unshakable knowing that she was loved and that she wasn't facing this battle alone. The next morning, Sarah woke feeling different. The exhaustion that usually greeted her in the morning was still there, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been. She felt lighter, more alive. Her boys noticed the change immediately. "You look happy," Ethan said, studying her face as she sipped her coffee at the breakfast table. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I am," she said simply. She didn't tell them about the angel, at least not yet. She wasn't sure they would understand. But she carried the experience with her like a treasure, a source of strength that she could draw on in the days to come. The visit hadn't cured her illness, but it had healed something far more important, her spirit. Sarah knew she still had a long road ahead, but for the first time since her diagnosis, she believed she could walk it. And she believed she wouldn't be walking it alone. The morning after Sarah's angelic encounter, the world felt different. For months, she had woken each day with a sense of dread, her body weighed down by exhaustion and her spirit crushed by the uncertainty of her illness. But today, there was something new, a lightness, a calm she couldn't explain. It wasn't that her symptoms had vanished. Her body still felt fragile, her energy still low. Yet inside, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in months. As the sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, Sarah lay still for a moment, replaying the events of the night before. The golden glow, the angel's smile, the reassuring touch, it all felt so vivid, so real. And yet, she couldn't help but question it. Had it been a dream? A figment of her imagination, born from desperation and exhaustion? She glanced around the room, half expecting to see some lingering trace of the angel's presence, a shimmer of light, a faint glow. But there was nothing, just the familiar sights of her cluttered bedside table and the framed photo of her boys that she kept next to her bed. Still, the memory of the angel's touch lingered in her mind, and as she sat up, she felt an unfamiliar strength coursing through her. By the time she made her way downstairs, her sons were already in the kitchen. Jeremy was pouring cereal while Ethan rummaged through the fridge for milk. They both looked up as she entered the room, their faces lighting up with surprise. "Morning, Mom," Jeremy said, his tone casual, but his eyes lingered on her a little longer than usual. "You're up early," Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of her thinning hair behind her ear. "I feel good today," she said simply. Ethan, ever the joker, raised an eyebrow. "Good enough to try my famous breakfast creation?" He held up a plate of what looked like an alarming mix of eggs, toast, and something orange she couldn't quite identify. She laughed, the sound surprising even herself. It wasn't forced or hollow, it was genuine. "Maybe not that good," she teased, ruffling his hair as she walked past him. "But I appreciate the offer." As the morning went on, Sarah found herself doing little things she hadn't done in weeks. Washing the dishes, straightening up the living room, even stepping outside to check on the small flower bed she used to tend so lovingly. Her movements were slow, her body still recovering from the effects of treatment, but the effort felt meaningful. With each small task, she felt a piece of herself returning. Later that day, Sarah had an appointment with her oncologist. Emily, her ever-reliable sister, arrived to drive her to the hospital. As they sat in the waiting room, Emily glanced at her. "You seem different today," she said, her tone a mix of curiosity and relief. Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to share. The experience of the previous night was so deeply personal, so sacred, that she wasn't sure she could put it into words. "I guess I just feel at peace," she said finally. "It's hard to explain." Emily studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Peace is good," she said softly, squeezing Sarah's hand. When the doctor called them in, Sarah braced herself for the usual routine of tests, updates, and medical jargon. But as the appointment progressed, something surprising happened. Her doctor, a kind yet pragmatic man who rarely showed much emotion, seemed unusually puzzled. "Your latest blood work is promising," he said, glancing at the screen in front of him. "Your white cell count has improved significantly, and some of the markers we were concerned about are stabilizing. It's not a complete turnaround, but it's unexpected progress." Sarah blinked, barely able to process his words. "Is that normal?" she asked, her voice shaky. The doctor shook his head. "It's not unheard of, but it's unusual, especially at this stage of treatment. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." As they left the hospital, Emily was practically glowing with excitement. "Did you hear that?" she said, practically bouncing as they walked to the car. "This is amazing, Sarah. I knew you'd get through this." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and wonder. She thought of the angel's words, "Your journey is not over." For the first time, she began to believe it. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She opened the small journal she had started keeping after her first prayer, and for the first time, she wrote about the angel. She described the golden light, the radiant presence, the overwhelming sense of love and peace. She wrote about the touch on her shoulder and the words that had stayed with her. "You are loved. You are not alone." As she wrote, tears streamed down her face. Not tears of sadness, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance she felt she'd been given, for the renewed hope that filled her heart, and for the presence of something greater than herself in her darkest hour. The days that followed were not without challenges. Sarah still had treatments to endure, and there were moments when the fatigue and pain returned. But the despair that had once consumed her was gone. In its place was a quiet strength, a belief that she was not walking this path alone. She began to notice small signs of change around her. Her sons, who had been so quiet and withdrawn, started to open up again. Jeremy began talking about his plans for college, and Ethan's laughter once again echoed through the house. Even Emily seemed lighter, her worry replaced by cautious optimism. Sarah also found herself drawn to helping others in small ways. During her visits to the hospital, she would strike up conversations with other patients, offering words of encouragement and sharing her newfound hope. She didn't talk about the angel, at least not yet, but her calm demeanor and positive energy seemed to uplift those around her. One afternoon, as she sat in the hospital waiting room, a woman beside her struck up a conversation. The woman, who looked to be in her 60s, was clearly nervous. She admitted it was her first round of chemotherapy, and she didn't know what to expect. Sarah listened patiently, then placed a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "It's going to be okay," she said, her voice steady. "It's hard, but you're stronger than you think. And you're not alone." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed to hear that." As Sarah left the hospital that day, she felt a quiet sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She had been given a gift, and she would spend every day she had left sharing it with others. The weeks following Sarah's miraculous encounter and her doctor's surprising update brought more changes than she ever could have imagined. Although her illness hadn't disappeared, the progress was undeniable. It wasn't just her body that was healing. Her spirit, once heavy with fear and despair, now felt light and full of purpose. Sarah began to notice that people around her were drawn to her newfound sense of peace. Friends who had been hesitant to visit during the worst of her illness now called regularly, eager to check in. Strangers she met during treatments or at the grocery store seemed to linger in conversation, their eyes searching hers for the quiet hope she carried. It was as if the light she had felt during her encounter with the angel had stayed with her, radiating outwards. One day, as Sarah was resting on the couch, Emily dropped by for a visit. Her sister had been her rock through the darkest times, but today she seemed unusually excited. "I signed you up for something," Emily said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" Emily laughed. "No, it's a good thing, I promise. There's a support group at the Community Center for Cancer Survivors and patients still going through treatment. I thought it might be nice for you to share your story and hear other stories too." Sarah hesitated. The idea of standing in front of strangers and baring her soul felt daunting, even if she had found peace in her journey. But Emily's enthusiasm was contagious, and deep down, Sarah knew she had something to offer. "All right," she said finally. "I'll give it a try." The following week, Sarah attended her first meeting. The room was small and unassuming, filled with a mix of people from all walks of life. Some were bald from chemotherapy, others looked perfectly healthy, and a few sat quietly in the back, their eyes downcast. The group leader, a kind woman named Linda, welcomed Sarah with a warm smile. "We're so glad you're here," she said. "This is a safe space. Share as much or as little as you like." As the meeting began, Sarah listened to others share their stories. Some spoke about their battles with fear and uncertainty, others about the toll cancer had taken on their families. One older man, a retired teacher, talked about how he had nearly given up hope before finding solace in gardening. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she felt a lump rise in her throat. The room was silent, all eyes on her. She took a deep breath and began. "I was diagnosed with lymphoma a few months ago," she said, her voice steady but soft. "At first, I didn't think I could handle it. The treatments, the fear, the uncertainty, it all felt like too much. But something happened to me a few weeks ago that changed everything." She paused, glancing around the room. The faces looking back at her were kind, encouraging. "I had a moment," she continued, "when I felt like I couldn't go on. I prayed, really prayed for the first time in years. And that night, I experienced something I can only describe as divine. I believe I was visited by an angel." A murmur went through the room, not of disbelief, but of curiosity. Sarah went on to describe the golden light, the angel's comforting presence, and the words that had stayed with her. "You are loved. You are not alone." When she finished, the room was quiet. Then Linda spoke. "Thank you, Sarah. That was beautiful. I think a lot of us needed to hear that." One by one, others in the group began to share their own stories. Moments of hope, unexplainable coincidences, and brushes with the divine. It became clear to Sarah that her experience wasn't so unusual after all. It was just one thread in a tapestry of miracles and resilience. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued attending the support group. She found herself looking forward to the meetings, not just for the chance to share her story, but for the connection and sense of community they provided. She began to form friendships with others in the group, like Mary Ann, a young mother battling breast cancer, and Dave, the retired teacher who always brought fresh flowers from his garden. One evening, after the group had ended, Mary Ann approached Sarah. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "Hearing your story gave me hope. I've been so scared, but you made me feel like maybe I'm not alone in this." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You're not," she said firmly. "None of us are." Inspired by her experiences at the group, Sarah decided to expand her outreach. She started writing down her story in greater detail, hoping to one day share it with a wider audience. She didn't know if it would take the form of a blog, a book, or something else entirely, but she felt compelled to put her journey into words. Each time she sat down to write, she felt the same warmth she had experienced during her encounter with the angel, as if the being's presence was still guiding her. Sarah also began volunteering at the hospital where she received her treatments. She would sit with patients during their chemotherapy sessions, offering a listening ear or simply holding their hand. Her presence seemed to bring comfort, and more than once, a patient remarked on the calm they felt when she was near. "You have a gift," one elderly woman told her. "It's like you carry a little bit of heaven with you." As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's health continued to improve. Her doctors were cautious but optimistic, calling her progress remarkable. Sarah, however, didn't focus too much on the medical side of things. She had come to see her illness not as a curse, but as a catalyst for transformation. It had brought her to her knees, but it had also lifted her to heights she never could have imagined. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. The sky was painted with hues of pink and gold, the colors blending together in a way that reminded her of the angel's light. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream about the future, not with fear, but with hope. She thought about her boys, now thriving in their own ways, and about the lives she had touched through her story and her presence. She thought about the angel's words, "Your journey is not over." She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And for that, she was endlessly grateful. The test of faith. As Sarah settled into her new routine, her life began to feel brighter. Her health continued to stabilize, her boys seemed happier, and she found purpose in sharing her story and supporting others. It felt as though the angel's touch had opened a door to a new chapter in her life, one filled with hope and gratitude. But as much as her faith had grown, the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. It started subtly at first. During one of her follow-up appointments, Sarah's oncologist noticed a slight fluctuation in her blood work. "It's nothing to worry about yet," he assured her. "But we'll need to monitor it closely." Sarah nodded, trying to remain calm, but the words gnawed at her in the days that followed. What if the progress she had made wasn't permanent? What if the cancer returned stronger than before? She tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like a shadow. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Jeremy noticed her quiet demeanor. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She forced a smile, not wanting to worry him. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." But Jeremy wasn't convinced. "You always tell us to talk about what's bothering us," he said. "Shouldn't you do the same?" His words struck a chord, and Sarah realized he was right. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, she sat on the porch and let herself cry. She wasn't angry or bitter. She was scared. For the first time since her angelic encounter, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her again. The next day, Sarah confided in Emily. Over coffee at the kitchen table, she shared her fears. "I've tried so hard to stay positive," Sarah admitted, her hands wrapped around her mug. "But sometimes I wonder if it's enough. What if this is just a temporary reprieve?" Emily listened intently, then reached across the table to take Sarah's hand. "It's okay to have doubts," she said gently. "You're human, Sarah. But don't forget what you've been through. You've already seen miracles. That angel didn't visit you for nothing." Her sister's words were a balm to her troubled heart. Sarah took a deep breath and decided to refocus on the things she could control. She doubled down on her writing, pouring her fears and hopes into the pages of her journal. She also returned to her prayer practice, seeking comfort in the quiet moments of reflection. As time went on, Sarah's faith was tested in other ways. One day, during her volunteer shift at the hospital, she met a young man named Alex. He was in his early 20s, full of life and humor, despite the fact that he was battling an aggressive form of leukemia. The two quickly bonded, and Sarah found herself looking forward to their conversations. But a few weeks later, Alex took a turn for the worse. Sarah visited him in his hospital room, sitting by his bedside as he struggled to stay awake. "You've been like a second mom to me," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for being here." Sarah held his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You've taught me so much," she said. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." When Alex passed away later that night, Sarah was devastated. She questioned everything: her purpose, her faith, even the angel's visit. If such a kind and vibrant soul could be taken so soon, what hope was there for anyone? In the days that followed, Sarah withdrew from her usual activities. She skipped the support group meetings and canceled her volunteer shifts. Even her boys noticed her change in demeanor. "Mom, you always tell us to keep going, no matter what," Ethan said one evening. "But it feels like you've given up." His words stung, but they also woke something inside her. Sarah realized she had been so consumed by grief that she had lost sight of the very things that had once given her strength. She couldn't let Alex's passing overshadow the lessons he had taught her: the importance of kindness, resilience, and living fully, even in the face of adversity. That night, Sarah prayed again, asking for guidance. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I feel lost. Please help me find my way." The next morning, Sarah woke with a renewed sense of clarity. She knew she couldn't let grief define her journey. Instead, she decided to honor Alex's memory by continuing to help others. She returned to the support group, where she shared her struggles openly. "I lost a friend recently," she told the group. "It made me question everything. But I realized that the best way to honor his life is to keep going, to keep spreading the light he brought into this world." The group responded with overwhelming support. Mary Ann, the young mother Sarah had befriended, hugged her tightly after the meeting. "You've inspired all of us, Sarah," she said. "Even when you're struggling, you remind us to keep the faith." As the weeks went on, Sarah began to notice small signs that seemed to reaffirm her path. A stranger's kind words, a beautiful sunset that reminded her of the angel's light, a passage in a book that spoke directly to her heart. It all felt like gentle reminders that she was not alone. One evening, as she was writing in her journal, Sarah felt a familiar warmth wash over her. It wasn't as intense as the night of her angelic encounter, but it was unmistakable. She closed her eyes and let the feeling envelop her, a sense of peace and love filling her to the brim. In that moment, she realized something profound. Faith wasn't about never having doubts. It was about holding on, even when the road felt uncertain. It was about finding strength in the smallest of blessings and trusting that the light would guide her through the darkness. By the end of the year, Sarah's life had transformed once again. She published a collection of her writings, titled Touched by Light, a journey of hope and healing. The book resonated with readers around the world, many of whom wrote to her, sharing their own stories of faith and resilience. Sarah also started a foundation in Alex's honor, dedicated to supporting young cancer patients and their families. The work brought her a sense of purpose and fulfillment she had never imagined. Through it all, Sarah continued to carry the angel's words in her heart: "You are loved. You are not alone." They became her mantra, a constant source of strength as she navigated the twists and turns of life. Though her faith had been tested, it had emerged stronger than ever. And Sarah knew, deep in her soul, that her journey was far from over. She still had work to do, lives to touch, and light to share.